I'm telling a new story, and you help me with your likes and comments. Chicago was waking up slowly, like a giant stretching after a long sleep. The morning light, breaking through the gray veil of clouds, filled the streets with a soft glow, reflected in the mirrored windows of skyscrapers. On one of the quiet streets in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, where red brick houses neighbor neat lawns, stood the house of Robert and Candace Walters. The two-story mansion with white columns at the entrance and wide windows behind which heavy curtains were visible was their fortress, their refuge from the bustle of the big city. But this morning there was something new in the air in the house, a slight tension, barely perceptible, like the smell of rain before a thunderstorm. Robert Walters, a 40-year-old man with a hard gaze and a touch of gray at the temples, sat at the kitchen table, leafing through the latest edition of the morning newspaper. His dark blue suit, impeccably pressed, spoke of a day filled with meetings and negotiations. Next to the newspaper lay neatly folded documents and an expensive silver watch, evidence that every minute of his schedule was valuable. Construction company Walters Construction, which he had founded 15 years earlier, was now at its peak. Contracts for new office buildings in downtown Chicago were pouring in, and the company's reputation was booming across Illinois. But success, as Robert knew better than most, was as fragile as thin glass and required constant attention and strict discipline. "Candace, have you seen my keys?" he called, not taking his eyes off an article about skyrocketing real estate prices and the new tax reform that could affect his projects. Candace, a slender woman with long brown hair pulled back into a neat bun, appeared in the kitchen doorway. She wore a light ivory housecoat that emphasized her petite frame. She held a tray of breakfast in her hands, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee and toasted bread filled the sunny kitchen with a comfort and calm that was rare in their busy lives. Her face, still retaining the soft beauty of youth, was lit by a warm, slightly tired smile. "On the hall dresser, as usual," she replied, setting a plate of scrambled eggs and golden, crisp toast in front of him. She adjusted her spoon on the saucer of jam and gently ran her hand over her husband's shoulder. "Bella's awake now, but I think she's trying to coax the cat into wearing her doll dress again." From somewhere beyond the wall came a muffled mew of protest, followed by a thin, childish laugh, and for a moment the tension left Robert's face. He smiled at the corner of his mouth, looking out the window, where the first rays of sunlight were gilding the neat backyard of their suburban home. "I hope that Kat ever gets over her love of dressing up," he muttered, putting down the newspaper and allowing himself, for the first time that morning, to feel that there was still something more important than contracts and numbers at this kitchen table. Robert chuckled, putting down his newspaper. His daughter, Bella, was their little hurricane, a 7-year-old with boundless energy and an imagination that sometimes baffled even her parents. "She needs more friends her own age," he remarked, taking a sip of coffee and watching the steam rise from his mug. "She spends too much time with that cat. What's his name? Mr. Whiskers?" "Mr. Whiskers," Candace corrected, sitting down opposite him. She pulled her teacup toward her, cupped it in her hands, and smiled a little tiredly. "And you're right, but she's so picky. Not everyone suits her. Remember how she said her friend from school was too boring because she didn't know who Sherlock Holmes was?" Robert laughed, but the laughter quickly turned to thoughtful silence. He ran his fingers along the smooth edge of the newspaper, as if smoothing out his troubled thoughts. "Speaking of Bella," he began after a pause, not looking at Candace, as if collecting his thoughts. "Are you sure Joshua can handle it? I mean, he hasn't seen her since she was a baby, and now he's going to live with us and help." He emphasized the last word with a light, almost mocking intonation, but his eyes were serious. Candace sighed and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. For a second, her eyes flickered with weariness or a memory of the endless conversations they'd had before agreeing to invite Joshua. "Rob, you asked him to come. You said he needed a break after all that stuff in Detroit. And besides, he's your brother. Families should help each other." "Cousin," Robert said dryly, tapping his fingers on the table. His gaze grew distant. "And I don't mind helping. It's just, Joshua's always been a little chaotic. Remember when he showed up to our wedding on a motorcycle, all in a leather jacket, trying to talk the DJ into playing heavy metal? Candace laughed, covering her mouth with her hand, but there was a slight note of concern in her laughter. Oh, that was something. All your uncles looked at him like he'd blown up a wedding cake. But he's not evil, Rob. It's just, he's living his life in his own rhythm, and he promised he'd help with Bella and the firm. Maybe that'll finally do him some good. Robert chuckled again and leaned back in his chair. He looked out the window, where a drop of dew was lazily trickling down the clean morning glass. Helping with Bella, he repeated quietly, more to himself. Do you really imagine Joshua as a nanny? To be honest, no, Candace answered honestly and laughed, shaking her head. But maybe Bella herself will bring order to his chaos. She's good at it. Robert couldn't help but smile at the corner of his mouth. I have no doubt about that. She sometimes makes fun of me too, like a little child. Candace reached across the table and touched his fingers. Everything will be fine, Rob. You gave him a chance, which means he should take it. Robert looked at her palm over his own and sighed. If he runs away, I won't run after him. Let him know. He knows, Candace said confidently, and he still came. There was a moment of quiet silence. Only the clock on the wall ticked steadily and evenly. Robert caught his wife's eye, and for the first time in this conversation, his wariness eased a little. Okay, let's see how long he can last without another motorcycle and his eternal ideas. He picked up his coffee mug again. If Bella doesn't kick him out first. Candace laughed softly and warmly, bringing warmth and light back into the kitchen. Meanwhile, upstairs, Bella sat on the floor of her room, surrounded by colorful blocks and dolls. Her blonde curls, inherited from her mother, were escaping from their braids, and her blue eyes were bright with enthusiasm. In front of her sat Mr. Whiskers, a ginger cat with a disgruntled expression, onto whom Bella was trying to put a tiny hat, clearly taken from one of her toys. Mr. Whiskers, you must look like a real detective, the girl said seriously, adjusting her hat. You and I are going to solve the mystery of the missing cookies from the kitchen jar. I know it wasn't me who ate them. The cat snorted and tried to knock the hat off with his paw, but Bella was adamant. No, no, you have to be serious. She raised a finger, imitating her school teacher. Detectives don't snort. They watch. The door to the room opened slightly and Candace looked inside. Bella, dear, come down and have breakfast. And leave the poor cat alone. He already looks like he's ready to sue you. Bella giggled, but obediently stood up, brushing invisible dust off her knees. Mom, when is this? Joshua coming. Dad said he's coming to live with us. Is he cool? Candace squatted down to be level with her daughter. He's interesting. Your Uncle Joshua loves adventures. I think you'll have fun with him. Does he know who Sherlock Holmes is? Bella asked suspiciously. Candace smiled. I think he knows. And if not, you will teach him. By midday, the Walters household had a new resident. Joshua Clark walked into the hallway with a battered leather shoulder bag and a wide grin on his face. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his denim jacket looked like it had seen more than one adventure. He was shorter than Robert, but broader in the shoulders, with that relaxed confidence that often irritated people accustomed to order. Rob, Joshua cried, throwing out his arms as if he were going to embrace the whole house. Chicago man, I forgot how shiny everything is here. How's the big boss doing? Robert, standing in the living room, folded his arms across his chest. Everything was under control until you arrived, he replied with a slight grin. How was the road? It was long and dusty, but I survived. Joshua dropped his bag on the floor and looked around. Cool house, bro. You clearly didn't work for nothing. Candace walked down the stairs, wiping her hands on her apron. Joshua, it's good to see you. She hugged him, ignoring the faint smell of gasoline coming from his jacket. How's Detroit? Joshua's face darkened for a moment, but he quickly returned the smile. Detroit is history, Let's just say I decided Chicago was more my style. He winked, clearly deflecting the topic. Robert noticed this, but decided not to press. For now. Okay, he said, pointing to the stairs. Your room is on the second floor, first one on the right. Make yourself comfortable, and this evening we'll talk about what you'll be doing at the firm. Oh, I'm ready to build skyscrapers. Joshua gave a playful salute. Or at least carry bricks. Candace laughed, but Robert just shook his head. Let's see how you handle paperwork. This is not like fixing a motorcycle. As the evening wore on, the house was filled with the aromas of dinner. Candace was preparing her signature dish, baked chicken with herbs and mashed potatoes. Bella, who had already met Joshua, sat at the table and looked at the new tenant with curiosity. Uncle Josh, she began, fiddling with the edge of the tablecloth, have you ever caught a criminal? Joshua, who had just taken a bite of bread, almost choked. Criminals? He asked, glancing at Robert. Well, let's just say I've escaped a couple of times from people who thought I was a criminal. Does that count? Bella giggled and Candace gave Joshua a reproachful look. Don't scare her with your stories, she said, but there was a slight mockery in her voice. What? Joshua winked at Bella. Your daughter seems like the type who loves a good story. Right, Bella? The girl nodded vigorously. Tell me about the motorcycle. Dad said you rode it to their wedding. Robert rolled his eyes. Don't remind me. That was the worst toast in the history of weddings. Joshua laughed, leaning back in his chair. Hey, I was young and enthusiastic. And then, your DJ still played Metallica, so I consider that a victory. The dinner continued in a light, almost casual atmosphere, but Robert could not shake the feeling that Joshua's presence in their home was not just a temporary change. Something told him that his cousin had brought with him not only a bag and a smile, but also the shadow of some secret that would yet make itself known. After dinner, when Bella had run off to play and Candace had done the dishes, Robert took Joshua into his office, a small, wood-paneled room with a massive desk covered in blueprints. So, Robert began, closing the door. Let's get this straight. What happened in Detroit? Joshua shrugged, but his gaze became more serious. Nothing worth talking about. Just, didn't get along with my business partners. Decided it was time to move on. Partners? Robert narrowed his eyes. You said you worked in a car repair shop. Yeah, Joshua scratched his head. Workshop, business, that kind of thing. Look, Rob, I'm here to start over. Give me a chance, and I won't let you down. Robert looked at him for a long time, trying to understand what was hidden behind these words. Finally, he nodded. Okay, you'll start at the office tomorrow. But Josh, I'm serious. No surprises. I have a family, a company, and commitments. I can't afford chaos. Joshua raised his hands in surrender. No surprises, boss. I promise. But when Joshua left the office, Robert stood by the window, looking out at the dark garden. Deep down, he knew that Joshua's promises, like his smiles, might not be as simple as they seemed. Now it's your turn. Tell us where you watch us, and what interesting things have happened to you or your friends. Mornings in the Walters home began with the usual rhythm, the ringing of the alarm clock, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and the soft sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. But today, a new note appeared in this measured dance of family life, the presence of Joshua Clark. His leather bag was still standing in the hallway, as if reminding that he was not here forever, but only passing through. However, his loud laughter, coming from the kitchen, said otherwise. Joshua clearly felt at home. Robert, already dressed in a formal gray suit, came downstairs, straightening his tie. He found Joshua at the table, sprawled in a chair, telling a story to Bella, waving his arms. The girl was giggling, her blue eyes shining with delight, and in front of her was a half-eaten plate of pancakes. And now, Bella, I swear, this guy thought the bike would move on its own if he just gave it a good push, Joshua winked, taking a sip of orange juice. Did he fall? Bella asked, leaning forward. You bet. Right into a puddle. Joshua laughed, and his laughter filled the kitchen like sunlight. Robert coughed to get attention. Josh, are you ready? We're leaving in 15 minutes. Today is your first day in the office. Joshua turned, his smile never wavering. Boss, I was born ready. He gave a mock salute, but his jeans and wrinkled t-shirt with some rock band logo on it were clearly not office attire. Robert frowned, but decided not to start the morning with a lecture. Get changed. We have a meeting with the contractors at 10. And Bella, finish your pancakes. You have to go to school in half an hour. Bella pouted, but obediently took her fork. Joshua stood up, patting the girl on the head. Listen to your dad, detective. And in the evening, I'll tell you about a bigger puddle. Candace watched the scene from the doorway, arms crossed. Her face was calm, but there was a hint of irritation in her eyes. As Robert passed her, heading for the car, she called out to him quietly. Rob, can I talk to you for a minute? He paused, looking at his wife. Candace always looked impeccable, even in her loungewear. Her dark green sweater brought out the color of her eyes, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. But now there was a restrained tension in her voice. What is it? Robert asked, glancing at his watch. Candace lowered her voice so that Joshua, still fiddling around upstairs, wouldn't hear. You're too soft with him. He just arrived, and already he's acting like this is his home. Telling Bella his stories, drinking our juice like he's the boss here. Robert sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Candace, he's my brother. I can't just throw him out on the street. He promised to help, and I'm giving him a chance. If he screws up, I'll deal with him myself. Cousin, she corrected, narrowing her eyes. And I'm not saying he should be kicked out. Just keep him in line. He doesn't seem like the type to take responsibility. Robert nodded, but his thoughts were already in the office, where the drawings of the new project and a pile of documents were waiting for him. I'll figure it out, he answered shortly, kissing his wife on the forehead. See you in the evening. Candace watched him go, but her lips were pressed into a thin line. She turned toward the kitchen, where Joshua had come downstairs, trying to tie his tie, clearly unsure which end to start with. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment there was silence. Joshua smiled, that same charming smile that had probably gotten him out of trouble more than once. What? He asked, adjusting the collar of his shirt. Not my style. Candace crossed her arms, her gaze colder than she expected. I just hope you realize this isn't a vacation, Joshua. Robert trusts you, and I don't want him to regret it. Joshua raised his eyebrows, but his smile didn't disappear. Wow, Candace, you're like a strict teacher. Don't worry, I won't let you down. He winked, but there was something in his tone that made her wary either mockery or a challenge. She wanted to answer, but at that moment Bella ran into the kitchen, holding a backpack. Mom, I'm ready. Uncle Josh, are you coming with us? Joshua turned to the girl, his face instantly softening. Not today, detective. I have to conquer your dad's office. But tonight, you and I will sort out the case of the missing cookies, okay? Bella nodded vigorously, and Candace turned away, hiding her irritation. She couldn't explain why Joshua made her so nervous. Maybe it was his easy manner, the way he seemed to glide through life without thinking about the consequences. Or maybe it was the way he looked at her not directly, not frankly, but with some kind of hint she couldn't decipher. Walter's Construction's office was in downtown Chicago, in one of the glass skyscrapers whose windows reflected the bustle of the city. Robert led Joshua through the spacious lobby, where they were greeted by the smell of freshly brewed coffee and a gentle hum of conversation. The employees, busy with their own affairs, cast curious glances at the new man, who clearly stood out from the strict office environment. This is your desk, Robert said, gesturing to a small workstation in the corner of the open office. You'll be sorting papers and preparing reports to start with. Nothing too complicated, but it does require attention. Joshua looked at the table, where a stack of folders already lay, and whistled. I seem to have fallen into paper hell, but okay, I'll manage. He threw his jacket over the back of a chair and rolled up his sleeves. When do we start building skyscrapers? Robert shook his head, but the corners of his lips twitched into a smile. First, learn to distinguish an invoice from a contract. If everything goes well, in a couple of weeks, I'll give you something more serious. He left Joshua with his paperwork and headed to his office for a busy day. But even as he immersed himself in his work, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that Joshua was a variable he couldn't control. His charm was like a bright firework, beautiful, but dangerous if you got too close. By the time Robert and Joshua returned home that evening, the atmosphere in the Walters house was electric. Candace was setting the table, but her movements were jerky, as if she were trying to vent her frustration. Bella was sitting on the couch, drawing in her sketchbook, humming a cartoon theme under her breath. "How was your day?" Candace asked, not looking at Joshua, who was already taking off his tie as if it was choking him. "Excellent," he replied, plopping down on a chair. "I'm now a master at sorting papers. I think I'll soon get the Nobel Prize in bureaucracy." Bella giggled and Robert smiled tiredly. "He's done it," he said, looking at his wife. "For now, at least." Candace set the pasta dish down on the table, but her gaze slid to Joshua again. This time he returned it, a quick, almost imperceptible glance that was more than just polite. Robert, busy pouring water into a glass, didn't notice, but the atmosphere at the table grew a little heavier. "Joshua, tell me more about the motorcycle," Bella asked, breaking the silence. Joshua smiled, but his eyes lingered on Candace for a moment. "Oh, detective, I have a better story. About how I once rode 100 miles on a broken bike to get to a concert. But that's after dinner, okay?" Candace slammed the plate down on the table, the sound making everyone jump. "Bella, eat," she said, her voice colder than usual. "And don't get distracted." Robert frowned but said nothing. He was used to Candace being abrupt at times, especially when she was tired. But tonight, her irritation seemed directed not just at Joshua, but at him for allowing this man into their lives. After dinner, when Bella ran off to listen to Joshua's latest story, Candace stayed in the kitchen, clearing away the dishes. Robert came up to her, hugging her from behind. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. She froze but did not turn around. "I'm just tired," she replied, but her voice was shaking with suppressed emotion. "And I don't like the way he interferes with our lives." Robert sighed, letting her go. "It won't be for long, Candace. He'll either come to his senses or leave. I won't let him ruin everything." She nodded, but her gaze was fixed on the window, where the darkness of the garden hid everything but the reflection of her own thoughts. And in the living room, Joshua, sitting on the sofa, was telling Bella another story, but his smile was not as carefree as before. Something in his eyes, a shadow, a hint, a mystery said that his stay in this house was only the beginning of something greater. The sun was setting, painting the Chicago sky in warm shades of orange and pink. The Walters house was filled with the usual evening bustle, the clink of dishes, the hushed voices, and Bella's laughter coming from the living room. But beneath the comfortable surface were cracks that were becoming more visible, like the first wrinkles on a still young face. Robert Walters had been staying at the office more and more often lately. His construction firm was on the brink of a major breakthrough. A contract to build a new downtown shopping center required his constant attention. Blueprints, meetings with investors, disputes with contractors, all of it was eating up his time, leaving only a few hours for his family. He returned home tired, with a hint of guilt in his eyes, but he assured himself that it was temporary. Success required sacrifice, and Robert was ready to make it. Today, however, he decided to leave early. The negotiations with the suppliers had ended unexpectedly quickly, and he, feeling a pang of nostalgia for family evenings, decided to surprise Candace and Bella. In his hands, he held a box of Bella's favorite chocolate cake from the bakery on the corner, and in his heart the hope for a quiet evening without work calls. When he entered the house, he was greeted by the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sounds of music, something light and jazzy flowing from the speakers in the kitchen. Robert smiled. Candace always turned on jazz when she was in a good mood. He set the cake down on the table in the entryway and headed toward the kitchen, but stopped in the doorway, as if he had run into an invisible wall. Candace stood at the stove, stirring something in a pot, and Joshua sat at the edge of the kitchen island, holding a mug. They were laughing not loudly, but with an intimate ease that made Robert freeze. Joshua, dressed in a black t-shirt and faded jeans, leaned a little closer to Candace, showing her something on his phone. She glanced at the screen, her lips curling into a smile, and she nudged him with her shoulder, as if sharing an old joke. "Seriously, Josh, you're incorrigible," Candace said, her voice soft, almost playful. "Where did you even find this?" "It's the internet, Candace. It's all there," Joshua replied, his eyes shining with laughter. "Want me to show you more?" Robert cleared his throat, and they both turned around. Candace's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "Rob, you're early," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "I didn't know you'd be back so soon today." Joshua jumped off the island, his movements as relaxed as ever. "Hey, boss," he exclaimed, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. "Thought you'd give us a chance to enjoy your company?" Robert nodded, but his gaze lingered on Candace. She looked slightly confused, her fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of the towel. "I brought a cake for Bella," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "Where is she?" "In the living room, playing with Mr. Whiskers," Candace replied, returning to the pot. "I'm making lasagna, your favorite. It'll be ready in half an hour." Robert nodded and headed into the living room, but there was a strange feeling growing in his chest, not suspicion exactly, but something close to it. He brushed it aside, chalking it up to fatigue. Candace and Joshua were just chatting. No big deal. Joshua had a way of making people feel at ease. It was part of his charm. And yet, something about their laughter, their closeness, left a bitter taste in his mouth. In the living room, Bella sat on the carpet, surrounded by colorful crayons and sheets of paper. Mr. Whiskers, her faithful red-haired companion, dozed next to her, ignoring her attempts to draw a detective badge on his tail. When she saw her father, Bella jumped up and ran to him with hugs. "Dad, you're home!" she screamed, throwing her arms around his waist. "Uncle Josh and I were looking for clues today." Robert raised an eyebrow as he sat down on the sofa and pulled his daughter onto his lap. "Evidence? What other evidence?" Bella leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if she were sharing a state secret. "Uncle Josh and I play detective when you're not around. He says Mom likes to play too, but she always says it's a secret." Robert froze. His smile remained in place, but something inside him tightened like a spring. "Playing with Mom?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Detectives?" Bella nodded, her curls bouncing. "Well, yeah, they whisper in the kitchen and then laugh. Uncle Josh says it's part of the investigation, but I shouldn't tell you because you're busy." Robert felt his heart skip a beat. He stroked Bella's head, forcing a smile. "You're a good boy, detective," he said, but his mind was already elsewhere. "Now go wash your hands before dinner." Bella ran away, and Robert sat there, looking at her drawings. One of them showed three figures, him, Candace, and Joshua, standing together. But something about the drawing, maybe the close distance between Candace and Joshua, or the way Bella had drawn them smiling, made him feel a twinge of anxiety. Dinner passed in tense silence, broken only by Bella's chatter and Joshua's occasional jokes. Candace was unusually silent, her gaze darting across the table, avoiding Robert's. Joshua, on the other hand, seemed at ease, telling a story about how he once almost got stuck in the office elevator. "Can you imagine? I thought I'd spend the whole night there," he said, cutting a piece of lasagna. "But then I remembered I had a penknife in my pocket. I opened the panel, rummaged through the wires, and voila, the elevator started moving." Bella clapped her hands, but Candace only smiled weakly. "You've always been a master of improvisation," she said, but there was no warmth in her voice. Robert watched them, trying to catch something that might explain his uneasiness. But all he saw was a normal dinner, normal conversations. And yet Bella's words rang in his head. "Uncle Josh plays with Mommy when you're not here." After dinner, when Bella had gone to bed and Joshua had gone to his room, Robert found Candace in the kitchen. She was standing at the sink, scrubbing a plate as if she wanted to rub the pattern off it. "Candace," he began, leaning against the door frame. "Is everything okay?" She flinched, but did not turn around. "Of course," she answered, her voice too sharp. "Just tired. Lots to do." Robert stepped closer, placing his hand on her shoulder. "Are you sure? You seem somehow different today." Candace finally turned, her eyes meeting him. There was something in them, something between fear and irritation, but she quickly looked away. "I just want things to be like they were, Rob," she said quietly, "before he came." Robert frowned. "Joshua, if he irritates you so much, I'll talk to him. He'll leave if that's what it takes." Candace shook her head, her fingers curling around her lip. "No, don't. Just give me time. I'll get used to it." She turned away, returning to the dishes, and Robert knew the conversation was over. But as he left the kitchen, his gaze fell on Joshua's phone, lying on the living room table. The screen glowed with a notification, a text from an unknown number. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Robert froze, his hand hovering over the phone. He knew he shouldn't, but curiosity, or maybe instinct, was stronger. He picked up the phone, but the screen had already gone blank. Password. Of course. He put the phone back down, feeling a mixture of anger and doubt boiling in his chest. Something was happening in his house, right under his nose, and he was going to find out what. The dark streets of Chicago, lit only by streetlights and the occasional window, seemed to mirror Robert Walters's inner state. He drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A whirlwind of thoughts swirled in his head, each one sharper than the last. The scene in the kitchen, Candace and Joshua's laughter, Bella's words, the text on his phone, all of it came together to form a mosaic that made his stomach churn. He didn't want to believe that his suspicions were justified, but the doubt, once conceived, had taken root and was now growing like a weed. The house greeted him with silence. The lights in the living room were dim, and the soft clink of dishes came from the kitchen. Robert took off his coat, hung it on the hanger, and took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. He was not a man who easily gave in to emotions, but today his nerves were taut like violin strings, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Candace stood at the sink, sorting through clean plates. Her movements were mechanical, almost detached, as if she were trying to distract herself from something that was bothering her. Robert paused in the doorway, watching her. Her dark hair, usually neatly pulled back, was now escaping its bun, and her shoulders were tense, as if she were expecting a blow. "Candace," he began quietly, trying to keep his voice calm, "we need to talk." She shuddered, but did not turn around immediately. She put the plate on the drying rack, wiped her hands with a towel, and only then looked at him. Her green eyes were wary, but there was a flicker of genuine fatigue in them. "About what?" she asked, crossing her arms. "You look like you're about to interrogate me." Robert stepped closer, feeling a lump in his throat. "I just want to understand what's going on. You've been different lately. And Joshua." He hesitated, choosing his words. "You've been communicating with him too much." Candace narrowed her eyes, her eyebrows drawing together into a thin line. She dropped the towel on the table and turned to face him. "Really, Rob? Are you saying that right now?" Her voice shook with barely contained anger. "You think I have something with Joshua, your brother?" "Cousin," Robert automatically corrected, but immediately regretted it. Candace stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "It doesn't matter. Do you really think I'm capable of something like that, after everything we've had?" She pointed a finger at him, her voice growing louder. "You've been missing out on work, Rob. You come home late, you barely notice Bella and me, and now when I try to be polite to your relative, you accuse me of something that isn't true." Robert felt his face heat up. He raised his hands, trying to calm her down. "I'm not accusing, Candace. I just—" He trailed off, unsure how to express what he was feeling. "Bella said you and Joshua were playing some kind of game when I wasn't around, and I saw you yesterday. You were too close." Candace froze, her face turning pale. For a moment, Robert thought he had touched something important, but she quickly recovered, her gaze becoming even sharper. "Playing? Rob, she's a child. She's talking about how Joshua helps her with her detective stories. We were laughing at some stupid video on the internet, that's all, and you're making a big deal out of it." She turned away, her voice quieter, but there was pain in it. "If you don't trust me, that's your problem, not mine." Robert opened his mouth to reply, but the words stuck. He felt like he was being cornered. Maybe he really was being paranoid. Maybe the fatigue and stress of his job were distorting his perceptions. But the look he'd seen between Candace and Joshua, the laugh that sounded too warm, he couldn't get it out of his head. "I trust you," he said finally, but his voice was unsure. "I just want things to be like before." Candace looked at him, her eyes full of a mixture of hurt and disappointment. "Then start by being home, Rob, and not looking for problems where there aren't any." She walked out of the kitchen, leaving him alone. Robert sank into a chair, feeling a heaviness spreading in his chest. He hated this feeling, a mixture of guilt and helplessness. He wanted to believe Candace, wanted to cast aside his doubts, but something inside him continued to burn like a smoldering ember. The next morning, Robert decided to talk to Joshua. He found him in his office, lazily leafing through a file, humming a tune. Joshua looked as relaxed as ever, with a slight smile that seemed to never leave his face. But today, Robert was looking at him differently, as if trying to see something beneath the mask that he hadn't noticed before. "Josh," Robert began, closing the office door, "we need to talk." Joshua leaned back in his chair, his eyebrows raised. "Wow, serious tone. What happened, boss?" Robert sat down opposite, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "I want you to be honest with me. What's going on between you and Candace?" Joshua's smile slowly faded, replaced by a look of mock hurt. He put his hand to his chest as if he had been hurt. "Seriously, Rob, you think I— what? Crossed the line with your wife?" He shook his head, his voice lower, almost dramatic. "How could you think that about your brother? I thought we were family." "Cousin," Robert corrected again, but his voice was quieter than he'd intended. "I'm not saying you did anything, but I see the way you interact. And Bella mentioned that you and Candace play when I'm not around." Joshua laughed, but it was a harsh, almost mocking laugh. "Playing. Rob, she's talking about my stupid detective stories. I entertain your daughter while you build skyscrapers, and Candace and I just hang out. She's cool, you know. But man, I'm not the kind of guy to butt into someone else's family." He leaned forward, his eyes growing serious. "If you don't trust me, just tell me. I'll pack my things and leave." Robert looked at him, trying to find the lie in his words, but Joshua looked sincere, or at least he was good at pretending to be. His dark eyes were open, and his posture was relaxed, as if he really didn't understand what the problem was. "I don't want you to go," Robert said finally, feeling his resolve melting. "Just keep your distance, okay? For everyone's peace of mind." Joshua nodded, his smile returning, but there was something else in it now, a slight shadow that Robert couldn't decipher. "No problem, boss. Everything will be fine." Robert spent the rest of the day in the office, immersed in his work, but his thoughts kept returning to his conversations with Candace and Joshua. Both assured him that nothing was happening, but their words did nothing to quench the fire in his chest. He felt paranoid, like a man who saw shadows where there were none. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Candace and Joshua in the kitchen, their laughter, their closeness, and the vision was like a knife slowly piercing his heart. That evening, when he returned home, he found Candace in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, leafing through a magazine, but her eyes were absent. Bella was already asleep, and Joshua, apparently, was in his room. Robert sat down next to her, but it was as if an invisible wall had grown between them. "Candace," he began, his voice soft, almost pleading. "If I'm wrong, I'm sorry. I don't want to lose you." She looked at him, her eyes full of a complex mixture of emotions: hurt, fatigue, maybe even guilt. "Then stop looking for what isn't there," she said quietly, "and start being with us, Rob. Not just in body, but in spirit." He nodded, but when she stood up and went upstairs, he sat there, staring into space. His mind screamed that he should trust his wife, his brother. But his heart whispered that he had already missed something important, and it was slipping through his fingers like sand. Chicago in early autumn was a city of contrasts. The bright colors of the parks stood next to the gray shadows of skyscrapers, and the cool wind off Lake Michigan brought with it the scent of change. For Robert Walters, this change was not only in the air, but also in his own home, where every day seemed like a test. The doubts he had tried to suppress now grew like weeds in his soul, and he could no longer ignore them. He felt that his family, his fortress, was crumbling, and the only way to protect it was to know the truth, no matter how painful it was. Robert had always been a man of order. His construction company had thrived precisely because he could anticipate risks and eliminate them before they became problems. Now he decided to apply this approach to his personal life. If Candace and Joshua were hiding something, he had to find out. Not for revenge, but for clarity, for taking back control of his life. And so the idea of installing cameras was born. Robert moved quickly and methodically. He ordered a set of wireless, high-resolution security cameras that could be connected to his phone via an app. They were installed one evening while Candace left with Bella for an art class and Joshua was left in the office, sorting through yet another pile of paperwork. Robert chose strategic locations, one in the living room, disguised as a charger, another in the kitchen, hidden among the kitchen utensils. The third, the most important, was installed in the bedroom, a tiny device mounted in a picture frame above the dresser. He hated himself for doing this, for invading their privacy, but the need to know outweighed the shame. He also installed a camera in the office, hiding it in a decorative plant on the windowsill. Joshua, despite his promises, still seemed unreliable to Robert. He was often late with reports, distracted by conversations with colleagues, and seemed to spend more time drinking coffee than working. Robert wanted to make sure that his cousin at least wasn't causing harm to the company. For the first few days, the cameras showed nothing but mundane life. Candace cooked dinner, Bella played with Mr. Whiskers, Joshua told his stories. He actually worked at the office, not as efficiently as he would have liked, but with no obvious lapses. Robert checked the tapes every night in his office, and with each passing day, he felt more and more guilty. Was he really paranoid? Was his suspicions just the product of a tired mind? But everything changed the night before his next business trip. Robert had a 2-day trip to St. Louis to meet with a potential investor. He hated the trips, but they were part of his job, part of what kept his family comfortable. He left early that morning, kissing Bella on the forehead and exchanging a brief, almost formal goodbye with Candace. Her eyes were tired, but she smiled, wishing him luck. Joshua was in his room, as usual, and Robert didn't say goodbye. Their relationship had been strained since their last conversation. That evening, sitting in his St. Louis hotel room, Robert opened his camera app. He hadn't planned to check the footage so soon, but something, maybe intuition, maybe paranoia, made him turn on the feed. The living room was empty, the kitchen was silent. He switched to the bedroom, expecting to see an empty bed, or at least Candace reading a book before bed. But what he saw was like a punch to the solar plexus. Candace sat on the edge of the bed, wearing the light silk robe he'd given her for their anniversary. Her hair was down, and she was holding a glass of wine. Across from her, on a chair by the dresser, sat Joshua. His posture was relaxed, but there was something predatory in his eyes, like a cat watching its prey. They spoke quietly, their voices barely audible over the camera's microphone, but Robert caught snatches of them. "I don't know, Josh, it's too risky," Candace said, her voice shaking, but there was no fear in it, more excitement. "Relax," Joshua replied, his smile soft, almost lulling. "No one will know. We're just enjoying the moment." He stood up and walked toward her, his movements smooth, confident. Candace didn't pull away when he sat down next to her, their shoulders almost touching. Robert felt the blood rush to his temples, his heart pounding as if it wanted to burst out of his chest. He turned up the volume, but their voices became even quieter, as if they knew someone might overhear. Joshua leaned closer, his hand sliding over her shoulder, adjusting the thin strap of her robe. Candace looked up at him, her eyes glittering in the dim light of the lamp. She didn't push him away, didn't stand up, didn't say no. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, letting his fingers linger on her skin. The moment stretched out in slow motion, and Robert felt his world crumble. Candace suddenly stood up. Her movements were abrupt, almost panicked. She walked towards the window, crossing her arms over her chest. "It's wrong," she said, her voice barely audible. "Robert, he doesn't deserve this." Joshua stood up, but did not come closer. His smile disappeared, replaced by an expression that Robert could not decipher, either disappointment or mockery. "You know he doesn't see you, Candace," he said quietly. "He only sees his work, his contracts, but I see you." Candace turned to him, her expression a mixture of anger and something else, longing, maybe. She opened her mouth to answer, but at that moment her phone rang. Her phone, lying on the nightstand, had sprung to life. She jumped, grabbed it, and looked at the screen. "It's Bella," she said, her voice firmer. "She's awake. I need to go to her." Joshua nodded, stepping back. "Go. We'll finish this conversation later." Candace left the room, and Joshua stood there, watching her go. Then he turned to the window, and his gaze seemed to slide straight into the camera. Robert froze, as if Joshua could see him through the screen. But he simply shrugged, picked up his drink, and walked away. Robert turned off the app, his hands shaking. He sat in the quiet of the hotel room, trying to process what he had seen. They hadn't crossed a line yet. But this closeness, these words, this look, it was more than a friendly conversation. It was a betrayal, subtle but no less painful. The next day, Robert returned home earlier than planned. He canceled the second meeting, citing a family emergency, and caught the first flight back to Chicago. His mind was a mess, anger, pain, guilt over spying on his wife, all mixed into a caustic cocktail. But most powerfully, he thought of Bella. His little girl, his light in the world, would not be the victim of his mistakes or someone else's games. He entered the house quietly, without announcing his return. Bella met him in the hallway, throwing herself into his arms with such force that he barely kept his balance. "Dad, you're back already," she cried, her curls bouncing with joy. "I drew you a skyscraper. Look." Robert smiled, though his heart was aching. He picked up the drawing, bright, a little rough, but full of love, and praised her, trying to keep his voice natural. "You're a good boy, detective," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Where's Mom?" "In the kitchen with Uncle Josh," Bella answered nonchalantly, returning to her pencils. Robert felt his fists clench. He headed toward the kitchen, each step hitting his chest like a hammer. Candace and Joshua were there, but this time it seemed innocent. She was chopping vegetables for a salad, and he was sitting at the table, leafing through a magazine. Candace was surprised when she saw Robert, her knife hovering in midair. "Rob, you were supposed to be back tomorrow," she said, her voice soft but filled with concern. Joshua looked up, his smile as perfect as ever. "Hey, boss, are you planning on giving us a surprise?" He put the magazine down, his tone light, almost mocking. Robert looked at them, his gaze darting between his wife and his cousin. He wanted to scream, to throw the truth he had seen on camera at them, but the image of Bella, her innocent smile, stopped him. He couldn't let his anger destroy her world. "Yes," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I decided to come back early, tired of traveling." Candace nodded, her eyes avoiding him. She turned back to the vegetables, her movements nervous, almost jerky. Joshua, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, but Robert noticed his fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the magazine. "Cool," Joshua said, standing up. "I'll go check on Bella. She promised to show me her new detective plan." He walked out, leaving Robert and Candace alone. The silence between them was heavy as lead. Robert looked at his wife, trying to find the woman he loved in her, but all he saw were her tense shoulders and downcast eyes. "Candace," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "We need to talk. Not now, but soon, and I want you to be honest with me." She looked at him, her face turning pale. "Rob, I—" She trailed off, as if the words were stuck in her throat. okay? Whenever you're ready." He nodded, but a fire was raging inside him. He knew he couldn't hold back his emotions for long, but for Belle's sake, he had to try. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Candace alone. In the living room, Bella was telling Joshua about her drawing, her voice full of enthusiasm. Robert watched them, his heart torn between his love for his daughter and the rage that threatened to consume him. That night, after Bella had gone to bed, Robert checked the cameras again. He didn't mean to, but his fingers opened the app, as if obeying some inner impulse. The day's footage was mundane. Candace and Joshua kept their distance, their conversations short and formal. But Robert knew that meant nothing. He had seen them at night, seen how thin the line was between innocence and betrayal. He closed his laptop and went to bed, but he couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with images that made him sick. Joshua touching Candace, her laughter, her eyes filled with something that wasn't meant for him. He clenched his fists, feeling anger mingle with despair. He didn't know what to do, how to protect his family without destroying them. But he knew one thing for sure. The shadow that had taken up residence in his home wouldn't go away on its own, and he would have to deal with it. Chicago was drowning in the cool of the night, and the stars above the city seemed cold, like the eyes of a man who had decided to take a desperate step. Robert Walters sat in his office, staring at the screen of his laptop, where the icon of the surveillance camera app was blinking. His fingers were frozen over the keyboard, and a mixture of determination and pain throbbed in his chest, as if his heart was beating in time with the ticking of the clock on the wall. He could no longer wait, could no longer pretend that everything was okay. The doubts that tormented him demanded an answer, and he was ready to get it at any cost. Robert had devised a plan with the same methodicality with which he ran his construction firm. He had announced to Candace and Joshua that he was going to Milwaukee for 2 days to meet with a new client. It was a plausible lie. Such trips happened regularly, and no one would suspect anything was amiss. He had even packed a suitcase, ostentatiously placing it in the trunk of his car, and in the morning, after hugging Bella and saying a dry goodbye to Candace, he had left. But instead of Milwaukee, he had gone to a small motel on the outskirts of Chicago, where he had spent the day checking cameras and preparing for whatever might await him that night. His plan was simple: return home unexpectedly at the darkest hour, when masks fall and secrets crawl out of the shadows. He didn't know what he would find, but he was prepared for anything, or so he thought. The day dragged on painfully. Robert sat in the motel, watching his phone screen as the cameras streamed the daily routine of his home. Candace was in the kitchen making dinner, Bella was drawing in the living room, and Joshua was entertaining her with his usual stories. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to confirm his worst fears. But Robert knew the night would tell more than the day. He had seen them in the bedroom, seen how thin the line was between innocence and betrayal, and now his mind was set for the worst. He left the motel by midnight. His car glided silently through the empty streets, headlights picking out road signs and the occasional passerby. He parked a block away from his house, so as not to give away his presence, and walked toward his mansion. His heart was pounding, but his movements were precise, almost mechanical. He felt like a hunter on a trail, but deep down he was afraid that his prey would tear his heart out. The house was dark, with only a dim light coming from the first-floor windows. Robert walked around the building, keeping to the shadows of the trees, and entered through the back door that led to the basement. He knew every creak, every rustle in the house, and he moved as silently as a ghost. When he reached the first floor, he paused, listening. The silence was almost palpable, but then he became aware of muffled voices coming from his office, a small room at the end of the hall where he kept blueprints and documents. Robert moved slowly toward the door, his hand clutching his phone. He turned on the video recorder, pointing the camera forward, ready to capture everything he saw. The office door was slightly open, and the dim light of a desk lamp shone through the crack. He paused, peering inside. Candace stood at the table, her silhouette clear in the soft light. She wore a flowing dress that hugged her figure, her hair flowing over her shoulders like a dark waterfall. Joshua was close, too close, his hand on the table, almost touching her fingers. They spoke quietly, their voices strained, but there was an intimacy to them that cut Robert like a knife. "I can't do this anymore, Josh," Candace said, her voice shaking but lacking resolve. "It's destroying me." Joshua leaned closer, his dark eyes glittering in the dim light. "Then stop struggling," he replied, his tone soft, almost hypnotic. "You know how you feel, and I know." Candace turned away, her hands balled into fists, but she didn't move away. Joshua reached out, touching her shoulder, and this time she didn't pull away. His fingers slid down her neck, lingering at her jawline, and Robert felt the blood rushing in his ears. He wanted to barge in, to scream, to smash everything he could get his hands on, but instead he stood still, continuing to film. His rage was cold as steel, and he channeled it into this moment, into this piece of evidence he held in his hands. Candace turned to Joshua, her eyes meeting his, and for a moment Robert thought she was going to push him away. Instead, she stepped closer, her hand coming to rest on his chest, as if she were trying to steady herself or herself. Joshua leaned in, their faces so close their breaths mingled, and Robert knew what was coming. His stomach clenched, but he didn't stop the recording. At that moment, there was a slight creak of floorboards somewhere above. Perhaps Bella had turned in her sleep, or Mr. Whiskers had jumped onto the bed. Candace flinched, backing away from Joshua, her face contorted in panic. "Shit," she whispered, pressing her hand to her chest. This, this shouldn't have gone this far." Joshua stepped back, his smile tight, but he didn't look guilty. "Relax," he said, his voice calm, almost mocking. "Nobody saw anything." Candace shook her head, her eyes shining with tears. "I can't, Josh. It's not right. Go away. Please." Joshua looked at her, his gaze long, almost searching, then he nodded and headed for the door. Robert barely had time to retreat into the shadows of the hallway, pressing himself against the wall. His heart was pounding so loudly he was afraid Joshua would hear. But Joshua passed him by without noticing him and went upstairs, whistling a tune as if nothing had happened. Robert remained standing, his phone still recording the empty office. Candace sat at her desk, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking. She looked lost, broken, and for a moment Robert felt a twinge of pity. But he quickly pushed it down, reminding himself of what he had seen. She hadn't stopped Joshua, hadn't pushed him away, hadn't said no with the force that would have convinced him. He turned off the recording and left the house as quietly as he had entered. Back in the car, he sat in the dark, staring at the screen of his phone, where the video lasted 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Those 3 minutes were his proof, his weapon, but they were also his death sentence. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew one thing. He would not make a scene. Not now. For Bella, for the sake of preserving at least the semblance of a family, he would keep his cool. The next morning, Robert came home as if nothing had happened. He walked into the house with a suitcase in his hand, feigning fatigue after the trip. Bella, as usual, rushed to him with hugs. Her joy was the only thing that kept him from falling apart. Candace met him in the kitchen, her face pale, dark circles under her eyes. She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "How was the trip?" she asked, her voice hoarse, as if she hadn't slept all night. "Fine," Robert replied, putting his suitcase down by the wall. His gaze was cold, but he forced himself to speak evenly. "The contract is almost in my pocket." Candace nodded, but her eyes avoided him. She turned toward the stove where the pancakes were frying, but her movements were awkward, almost jerky. Joshua came downstairs a few minutes later, his hair disheveled and his shirt slightly wrinkled. He looked like a man who had just woken up, but his smile was as perfect as ever. "Hey, boss," he exclaimed, clapping Robert on the shoulder. "Didn't expect you so early. How's Milwaukee?" Robert looked at him, his gaze was heavy, but he didn't let his emotions get the better of him. "Everything is according to plan," he said briefly, walking away to the table where Bella was already laying out her drawings. Joshua shrugged and sat down at the table, pouring himself some coffee. His casualness was almost insulting, but Robert remained silent. He knew he held something in his hands that could destroy this false harmony, but he hadn't yet decided how to use his weapon. Breakfast passed in tense silence, broken only by Bella's chatter. Candace barely ate, her fingers fiddling nervously with her napkin, while Joshua, on the other hand, seemed at ease, joking with Bella and even offering to cook dinner. Robert watched them, his face unreadable, but inside he felt his anger rising like lava about to erupt from a volcano. After breakfast, he retreated to his office, closing the door. He plugged his phone into his laptop and watched the video again. Every frame, every gesture, every word burned him like acid. He saved the file in an encrypted folder, deciding he would show it to Candace when he was ready. But for now, he had to focus on Bella, on protecting her from the storm that was inevitably coming. Robert walked out of the office, his resolve set like concrete. He didn't know how this story would end, but he knew he wouldn't let Joshua or Candace destroy his family. He would wait, plan, act, and when the time came, the truth would come to light, a shadow that could no longer be ignored. Chicago woke up under a blanket of gray clouds that seemed to mirror Robert Walters's inner storm. The morning was cold, with a sharp wind that blew dry leaves through the streets, a reminder of how quickly things could change. The Walters household was deceptively quiet, Bella getting ready for school, Candace silently making breakfast, and Joshua, as always, trying to lighten the mood with his jokes. But to Robert, this semblance of normality was a thin layer of ice, ready to crack under the slightest pressure. He held the proof of betrayal in his hands, and now it was time to act. Robert had long ago learned to hide his emotions. His success in business had been built on his ability to keep his cool, even when everything inside was seething. Now that ability had become his shield. He had no intention of making a scene or shouting that would have been too easy, too chaotic. Instead, he had chosen the path of cold, methodical revenge, where every move was calculated, like a game of chess. Robert's first appointment was with his lawyer, David Crow, a man with a sharp mind and a reputation that made his competitors nervous. David's office was in a skyscraper in downtown Chicago, where the glass walls reflected the city's cool glare. Robert walked into the office, holding a flash drive containing the video that would become his heaviest burden. David, a man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed beard and a piercing gaze, rose from the table and shook Robert's hand. "You look like you're ready to declare war," he remarked, gesturing toward the leather chair. "What happened?" Robert sat up, his movements restrained, but his fingers shaking slightly as he placed the flash drive on the table. "I need you to look at this," he said, his voice level but steely with determination. "And I told you what my options are." David raised an eyebrow, but without further question, he plugged the flash drive into his laptop. The video from the office, where Candace and Joshua stood too close, their voices, their gestures filled with unspoken intimacy, filled the screen. David watched silently, his face unreadable, but Robert noticed his fingers tightening slightly on his pen. When the video ended, David leaned back in his chair, looking at Robert. "It's serious," he said finally, "but it's not clear. They didn't cross the line, at least not on this tape. Legally, it's not proof of infidelity if you're thinking about divorce." Robert nodded, his gaze directed towards the window where clouds were slowly creeping over the horizon. "I don't want a divorce. Not now. This is for Bella," he said quietly. "But I want Joshua out of my life, and I want him to pay for it." David tapped his pen on the table, his gaze growing even sharper. "Okay? Joshua works for your company, right? As the owner, you have the right to fire him. But listen." "Yes," Robert confirmed. "He's on a temporary contract with no guarantees, and I gave him access to several of the company's petty cash accounts. I want to block them." David nodded, making notes in his notebook. "The termination is simple. We'll draw up a notice. He'll be fired within a day. As for the accounts, I can prepare documents to freeze his access to any corporate accounts. If he's misused them, we can audit them and, if necessary, sue for fraud." "But Rob, are you sure you want to go that far?" Robert looked at him, his eyes cold as ice. "He's gone too far," he replied, and there was no doubt in his voice. David nodded, realizing that there was no point in arguing. I'll have it all ready by tomorrow morning. Dismissal, freezing of accounts, and if necessary, we'll start collecting evidence for a possible lawsuit. But Rob, he paused, looking at him with sympathy, be careful. This kind of thing can come back to haunt you, especially if it goes to court. Robert just nodded, his mind elsewhere. He didn't want a trial, he didn't want public humiliation. But he did want Joshua to feel the consequences of his actions. Back at Walter's construction, Robert called Joshua into his office. He walked in with his usual ease, his smile as always bordering on mockery. But today, Robert wasn't going to tolerate his games. He sat at his desk, his hands folded, his eyes sharp as a blade. "Sit down, Josh," he said, pointing to the chair opposite. Joshua sat up, his posture relaxed, but with a hint of wariness in his eyes. "Something serious?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. Robert didn't answer right away. He opened a drawer, pulled out a letter of resignation he had prepared in advance, and placed it in front of Joshua. "You're fired," he said, his voice as cold as a winter wind. "As of this moment, you are no longer employed by Walter's Construction. All accounts you had access to have been frozen. Your belongings have already been packed and will be delivered to your home this evening." Joshua froze, his smile slowly fading. He picked up the document, ran his eyes over the lines, and his face paled. "Rob, are you serious?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "What the hell? Did I do something wrong?" Robert looked at him, his eyes empty, devoid of emotion. "You know what you've done," he said, each word falling like a stone. "Get out of my office and out of my house by tomorrow morning." Joshua opened his mouth to protest, but something in Robert's face, a cold, unyielding determination, silenced him. He stood up, his movements jerky, almost jerky. "You're wrong, Rob," he said, but his voice was shaking. "You're making a mistake." "Go away," Robert repeated, and his tone brooked no argument. Joshua left, slamming the door, but Robert didn't move. He could feel the anger and pain fighting inside him, but he didn't let it come out. He was too disciplined for that. That evening, when Robert came home, Candace was waiting for him in the living room. Bella was already asleep, the house was quiet, but the silence was heavy, like before a storm. Candace was sitting on the couch, her hands nervously fiddling with the hem of her sweater. She looked exhausted, her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. "Rob," she began, her voice shaking. "Joshua said you fired him. What's going on?" Robert sat across from her, his face unreadable. He pulled out his phone, opened the video, and silently handed it to Candace. She took the phone, her fingers shaking as she pressed play. As the video progressed, her face grew paler and her eyes filled with tears. "Rob, She began, but her voice broke. She set the phone down on the table, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control them. "It's not what you think. I swear we didn't." "Enough," Robert interrupted, his voice quiet but firm as granite. "I've seen enough, and I know enough." Candace stood up, her movements desperate. She walked over to him, kneeling in front of his chair, her hands gripping his. "Please, Rob," she begged, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was wrong. I was lonely. You were always at work, and Joshua. He was there. He listened to me. But I didn't mean it, I swear. I stopped. You saw me. I stopped." Robert looked at her, his face a mask of calm, but inside he felt his heart breaking. Her tears, her words, all of it was real, but it couldn't erase what he'd seen. It couldn't erase the pain that burned through him like hot iron. "I don't know what to think, Candace," he said finally, his voice even but tired. "I don't know if I can trust you." She sobbed, her hands squeezing him tighter. "Please, Rob, for Bella, for us. Give me a chance to make it right. I'll do whatever you say. I can't lose you." Robert looked at her, his eyes empty, but with a hint of pain in them. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, gently pulling his hands out of her grip. "I need time," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'll think about it." He turned and walked into his office, closing the door behind him. Candace remained on the floor, her sobs echoing in the empty house. Robert sat at his desk, his gaze falling on the framed photograph of Bella. Her smile, so pure and innocent, was the only thing keeping him from letting his anger consume him. He didn't know if he could forgive Candace. He didn't know if he could trust her again. But he knew that for his daughter's sake, he had to at least pretend to try. He opened his laptop and began making a to-do list for tomorrow, not because he needed one, but because order was the only thing keeping his world from falling apart. Joshua left the next morning, his bag hastily packed, his face dark as a storm. He didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note, and Robert didn't stop him. The accounts were frozen, the firm was closed, and the shadow Joshua had brought into their home began to slowly dissipate. But Robert knew the wounds that Shadow had left would take a long time to heal, if they ever did. Chicago, on this gray October day, seemed like a city frozen in anticipation. Heavy clouds hung over the skyscrapers, and a cold wind off Lake Michigan cut into the bones, as if a storm was coming. Inside Walter's Construction, the atmosphere was no less tense. Employees who were usually absorbed in their own affairs whispered among themselves, casting wary glances toward Robert Walters's closed office door. They sensed that something was about to happen today, something that would change the routine of their workday. Robert stood at the window of his office, looking out over the city he had helped build. His hands were clasped behind his back, his face as impassive as a concrete wall. He had spent a sleepless night, considering every move he was about to make. The firing of Joshua he had announced the day before had been just the first blow. Today, he was going to finish the job, not just fire his cousin, but make him feel the full weight of his actions. This was not an impulsive decision, but a carefully planned move that left no room for emotion, only cold justice. He called the entire staff to a meeting in the conference room. This was unusual. Robert rarely called the entire team together, preferring to resolve issues individually. But today he wanted everyone to see, to know. He was not going to hide the truth, at least the part of it that concerned Joshua. The conference room was filled with a low hum of voices as Robert walked in. The staff engineers, managers, secretaries were seated at a long table, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Joshua was already there, sitting in the far corner, his posture tense, his usual smile gone. He knew he hadn't been called in for praise, but he didn't yet seem to understand the magnitude of what was about to happen. Robert took his place at the head of the table, his gaze slowly sweeping over the assembled group. He wasted no time in introducing himself. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice calm but with a steely determination. "Today, I have an important decision to make regarding one of our employees. Joshua Clark is no longer with Walters Construction. His contract is terminated effective today, with no further references from our company." A silence fell over the room, so thick it seemed you could cut it with a knife. The staff looked at each other, some whispered, but no one dared ask a question. Joshua, who was sitting at the edge, sat up straight, his face pale, his eyes narrowed. "Rob," he began, his voice hoarse but trying to keep it light, "are you serious? In public? Without warning?" Robert turned to face him, his gaze cold as winter ice. "You got your warning yesterday," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You knew your behavior in this company and beyond had consequences. I gave you a chance, Josh. You failed." Joshua clenched his fists, his cheeks flushed with anger or shame. Robert couldn't tell. He stood up, his movements jerky, almost jerky. "It's personal, isn't it?" he snapped, his voice shaking. "You're throwing me out because of some nonsense you've made up." Robert didn't flinch. He pulled a piece of paper from the folder, the official notice of dismissal, and placed it on the table in front of Joshua. "This isn't personal," he said, his voice even but strong. "This is business. You've broken the trust I gave you. You're no longer part of this company. You can take your things and leave." The staff members were silent, their eyes darting between Robert and Joshua. Some looked shocked, others confused, but no one intervened. Joshua opened his mouth to protest, but then thought better of it. He grabbed the notice, crumpled it in his hand, and headed for the exit without saying a word. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing in the quiet room. Robert looked at the staff, his face impassive. "If anyone has any questions, ask them now," he said. "If not, get back to work." No one asked questions. People began to disperse, their whispers filling the room like a gentle breeze. Robert returned to his office, closed the door, and allowed himself to exhale. The first blow had been dealt, but he knew it was only the beginning. By evening, news of Joshua's dismissal had reached his parents, Robert's aunt and uncle, who lived in suburban Chicago. John and Mary Clark were old-school people who valued family, but even more, honesty. Robert hadn't planned on involving them in the story, but the truth, as he had expected, was spreading fast. He got a call from Uncle John on his way home, and his voice was as heavy as lead. "Robert," John began without preamble, "Mary saw Joshua today. He said you kicked him out for no reason. What's going on?" Robert gripped the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road, but his thoughts were somewhere far away. "It was not without reason, Uncle John," he replied, trying to keep his voice even. "Joshua, he crossed the line, not just at work, but in my home. I don't want to go into details, but believe me, I had my reasons." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Robert heard John sigh heavily. "He mentioned Candace," John said finally, his voice quieter. "He said you had it all wrong. But I know you, Rob. You're not the type to act rashly. If you say he's guilty, I believe you." Robert felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected the conversation with his uncle to be so difficult. "Thank you," he said shortly. "I didn't want it to end this way." "We did too," John replied. "But Joshua chose his own path. Mary and I won't support him if he did the wrong thing. He called, asked for money, but we refused. He has to deal with his own problems." Robert nodded, although his uncle couldn't see him. "I understand," he said. "Thank you for your support." When the call ended, Robert felt a strange mixture of relief and heaviness. The Clark family had always been close, but now that closeness was torn apart, and he knew Joshua would find no support from his parents. Without a job, without money, without references, his cousin was trapped in a trap of his own making. Candace was waiting for Robert at home. She was sitting in the living room, her eyes red from crying, her hands nervously fiddling with the hem of her dress. Bella was at her grandmother's. Candace had insisted that the girl spend the evening away from home, and Robert did not object. He knew that their conversation would be difficult, and he did not want his daughter to witness it. "Rob," Candace began, standing as soon as he entered. Her voice was shaking, but there was determination in it. "I know what you did to Joshua, and I know what you saw. Please, let me explain." Robert looked at her, his face cold as marble. He didn't answer, but simply sat down in the chair, pointing her to the sofa opposite. "Speak," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Candace sat up, her fingers clenched into fists. She looked like she was struggling to speak. "I was lonely, Rob," she began, her eyes shining with tears. "You're always at work, you can't see me, you can't hear me. Joshua, he was there. He listened, he made me feel alive. But I swear, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I stopped, you saw, I stopped." Robert was silent, his gaze heavy, piercing. He saw her tears, heard her words, but they did not touch him as before. All he felt was a cold emptiness where love had once been. "I was wrong," Candace continued, her voice breaking. "I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it. But please, Rob, for Bella, for us, give me a chance. I'll do anything to earn your trust back." Robert looked at her, his face expressionless. He thought about the video, about the way her hand had been on Joshua's chest, about how she hadn't pushed him away. He thought about Bella, about her smile, about her innocence that he had to protect at all costs. And he thought about himself, a man who had built his life on control, but now felt that control slipping away. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice quiet but steely. "But don't expect things to go back to the way they were, Candace. You've broken something, and I don't know if it can be fixed." She sobbed, her hands covering her face, but Robert didn't console her. He stood up and walked towards his office, leaving her alone. Closing the door, he sat down at his desk, his gaze falling on the photograph of Bella next to the blueprints for the new project. Her smile was the only thing keeping his world from falling apart. Joshua was devastated, no job, no money, no family support. But Robert knew the real battle was still ahead. Candace begged for forgiveness, and he pretended to consider it, but deep down he wasn't sure he could ever trust her again. His revenge was cold, but it brought no relief, only an emptiness that grew deeper with each passing day. Chicago in November was cold and merciless, like the truth Robert Walters was about to tell the world. The gray skies, with a light rain falling, reflected his inner state, a mixture of determination and exhaustion that burned him from the inside. The Walters home, once filled with the warmth of family evenings, now seemed empty, like an abandoned building. Bella, his only ray of light, spent her days with her grandmother, while Robert prepared for the final step in his war for justice. He could no longer live in the shadow of betrayal, and although his heart still ached for Candace, he knew there was no turning back. Robert didn't make the decision to divorce right away. The weeks after Joshua left were filled with silent dinners, strained conversations, and tears from Candace that no longer touched him the way they once did. He gave her a chance to explain herself, but her words of loneliness, of weakness, of regret were echoes that could not fill the void she had left in him. He thought about Bella, about the way her innocent eyes would look at him if he allowed this wound to fester, and he decided that divorce was the only way to protect his daughter and himself. Robert met with David Crow, his lawyer, in his glass-walled office, reflecting the cold glare of the city. He placed a flash drive containing the video footage in front of him, along with a folder of additional evidence. Text messages he had found on Candace's phone when she had once left it without her password, and accounts from neighbors who had seen Joshua leaving their home late at night. This was no mere emotional outburst. Robert had been gathering evidence with the same methodicalness with which he had built his skyscrapers. David looked through the materials, his face impassive, but his eyebrows rose slightly when he saw the video from the office. "That's compelling," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Fault-based divorces are rare in Illinois, but with this evidence, we have a good chance of proving Candace's immoral behavior. It could impact the court's decision on custody and child support." Robert nodded, his gaze directed towards the window where the rain was making patterns on the glass. "I want Bella to stay with me," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "All of it. And I don't want Candace to get a dime. She ruined our family, David. She doesn't deserve anything." David tapped his pen on the table, his eyes studying Robert carefully. "I understand your feelings, but the court will look at the best interests of the child. Bella is your daughter, and you are a stable parent with a good reputation. But Candace may try to challenge custody, claiming that she was the primary caregiver. We must be prepared." Robert clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "She doesn't deserve Bella," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Do whatever it takes to keep her with me." David nodded, making notes in his notebook. "I'll prepare the paperwork to file for a fault-based divorce. We'll use video, text messages, and evidence to prove her immoral behavior. It'll give us a strong case. But Rob," he paused, looking at him sympathetically, "it's going to be hard. For you, for Bella, are you ready for this?" Robert looked at him. His eyes were cold, but there was a shadow of pain in them. "I'm ready," he said. "For Bella, I'll do anything." The court date was set for a month later, but for Robert, every day dragged on. He tried to keep Bella away from the stress, sending her to her grandmother's or to extra art classes, but her questions, "Why is Mommy sad?" or "When is Uncle Josh coming home?" cut him like a knife. He answered evasively, hiding his pain behind a smile, but he knew that soon she would have to know the truth. Candace, realizing that divorce was inevitable, tried to establish contact. She called, wrote, came to the office, begging Robert to change his mind. One evening, she showed up at the house when Bella was already asleep. Her face was pale, her hair was disheveled, and her eyes were full of despair. "Rob, please," she began, standing in the living room doorway, her voice shaking. "I know it's my fault, but don't ruin our family. For Belle's sake, we can fix this." Robert looked at her, his face unreadable. He felt the anger and pain fighting inside him, but he didn't let them come out. "You've already destroyed our family, Candace," he said, his voice as cold as the winter wind. "I've filed for divorce. The court will decide what happens next." She sobbed, her hands clenched into fists. "You can't take Bella away from me," she said, her voice breaking. "She's my daughter." "She's my daughter too," Robert replied, his gaze hard. "And I'll do anything to protect her, even from you." Candace stepped back, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't say another word. She walked away, leaving only the echo of her footsteps behind her, and Robert felt his heart tighten. He didn't want to be so cruel, but the truth he saw on the video left him no choice. The day of the trial was cold and clear, with a pale sun breaking through the clouds. The courtroom was austere, with wood paneling and rows of chairs filled with only a few spectators, mostly lawyers and clerks. Robert sat next to David, his suit impeccable, but with dark circles under his eyes, a sign of sleepless nights. Candace sat across from him, her lawyer, a young woman with sharp eyes, whispering in her ear. Candace looked haggard, her face pale, her hands fiddling nervously with her purse. The judge, an elderly woman with a stern face, reviewed the documents before the hearing began. She called David to present his case. "Your Honor," David began, his voice clear and confident, "my client, Robert Walters, has filed for divorce on the grounds of immoral conduct against his wife, Candace Walters. We have evidence of her inappropriate behavior, including videotapes, correspondence, and witness statements that demonstrate her involvement with another man in their marital home." A low hum filled the courtroom, and the judge raised her hand for silence. David turned on a laptop connected to a projector and showed a video from the chamber. Candace and Joshua, their closeness, their words, their gestures, all of it played out on the screen like a silent accusation. Candace covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking, and her lawyer tried to object, arguing that the video did not prove physical infidelity. "Your Honor," Candace's attorney said, standing, "these records show a moment of weakness, not an act of adultery. My client admits her mistake, but she did not cross the line, and her behavior should not deprive her of custody of her daughter." The judge looked at her, her gaze cold and penetrating. "I'll look at all the evidence," she said, "but emotional betrayal, especially in the presence of a child, can be as devastating as physical betrayal. Go on, Mr. Crow." David presented text messages between Candace and Joshua that were full of innuendo and double entendres, and testimonies from neighbors who saw Joshua in their home late at night. He also emphasized that Robert was the family's primary breadwinner, a stable and responsible parent, while Candace, he said, had jeopardized their daughter's well-being. When it was Candace's turn to speak, she stood up, her voice shaking but trying to keep it together. "Your Honor," she began, her eyes filling with tears, "I admit I made a mistake. I was lonely, I felt abandoned, but I never wanted to break up our family. I love my daughter more than anything in the world, and I beg you not to take her away from me." The judge looked at her, her face unreadable. "Mrs. Walters," she said, "your actions had consequences. The court will consider the interests of the child first." The hearing lasted for hours, but for Robert it was a blur. He listened to the arguments, looked at Candace, saw her tears, but all he could think about was Bella. He didn't want her to grow up in a house where lies and betrayal were the norm. He didn't want her to see her mother look at another man, the way she was supposed to look at him. A week later, the judge made her decision. Robert was awarded full custody of Bella based on evidence of Candace's immoral behavior and his stability as a parent. Candace was denied child support because the court found her actions to be detrimental to the family. She was allowed to see Bella on weekends under supervision, but Robert knew this would be a formality. Candace had lost not only his trust, but her place in their lives. As they left the courtroom, Candace stopped him in the hallway, her face puffy from crying, but her eyes still gleaming with desperation. "Rob," she said, her voice hoarse, "you shouldn't have done this. You took everything from me." Robert looked at her. His gaze was cold, but there was a shadow of pain in it. "You took everything from us, Candace," he said quietly. "I'm only protecting what's left." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the empty hallway. His heart was heavy, but he knew he had made the right choice. Bella was waiting for him at home, and for her sake, he was willing to endure any pain. Joshua was gone from their lives. Candace was cut off like a diseased organ, but the scars they left behind would stay with Robert forever. He sat in the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. The rain had stopped, and a faint ray of sunlight was breaking through the clouds, as if promising that even after the darkest night, a new day would come. Chicago had been through a brutal winter, but this year it seemed especially merciless. Snow blanketed the streets, and the icy winds off Lake Michigan chilled the bones, reminding him of how quickly life could turn into a frigid wasteland. For Robert Walters, however, this winter was a cathartic one. His world, once shattered by betrayal, began to slowly rebuild itself, like a building being built on a new foundation. He had lost much, but he had gained something priceless: clarity and purpose, something worth living for. Joshua Clark left Chicago in early December, driving away in an old pickup truck that barely ran. His bag, the same battered leather one he'd brought to the Walters house, was all he took. With no money, no job, no family support, Joshua was alone, like a ship cast ashore by a storm. His parents, John and Mary, had abandoned him completely when the truth about his behavior came to light. Their call to Robert was short but hard. They apologized for their son, but did not plead for him. Joshua, who had always glided through life with ease, was now faced with a reality where his charm could open no doors. Word of his dismissal and the reason for it had spread through Chicago's business circles, and no company in town wanted to associate with a man whose reputation was tarnished. Where he had gone, no one knew, and Robert didn't care. Joshua became a shadow from the past that he was ready to forget. Candace, deprived of child support and full custody, moved into a cheap apartment on the outskirts of town. Her new home, a small one-bedroom apartment in an old brick building, was a far cry from the cozy mansion in Lincoln Park. She found a job as an administrator in a small office, but her salary was barely enough to cover the rent and modest expenses. Her calls to Robert became less frequent, but each time she called, her voice trembled with desperation. She begged to see Bella, to be given a chance to be a mother, but the court was adamant. Her visitation rights with her daughter were limited to 2 hours every Sunday under the supervision of a social worker. Candace tried to appeal the decision, but her lawyer, faced with irrefutable evidence of her behavior, advised her to accept it. Robert felt no joy in her fall, but he had no pity left either. She had chosen her own path, and now she had to live with its consequences. Robert, on the other hand, was determined to move forward. His construction company continued to prosper. A contract for a shopping center in downtown Chicago had been signed, and new projects were on the horizon. But his life no longer revolved solely around work. Bella had become his center, his reason for getting up in the morning. He spent every free moment with her, helping with homework, playing her detective games, and even participating in school activities that he had previously considered a waste of time. He saw the way her eyes lit up when he complimented her drawings or listened to her endless stories about Mr. Whiskers, and it filled his heart with a warmth he had almost forgotten. But Robert wasn't content to just be a dad. He felt that his experiences, the pain of betrayal, the struggle to protect his daughter, the loneliness he'd endured could help others. And so the idea for the foundation was born. He called it the frame, after the construction term for the skeleton of a building, its foundation. The single father's foundation became his passion, his way of giving back to the world what it had taken from him. Robert poured some of his savings into it, hired a small team, and began organizing support groups, legal counseling, and financial assistance for men in situations similar to his own. He spoke at meetings, sharing his story, but never going into personal detail. His words were simple but heartfelt. "You are not alone, and you can build a new life, no matter how hard it gets." The foundation quickly attracted attention. Local newspapers wrote about it, calling Robert a man who turned personal tragedy into hope for others. He wasn't looking for fame, but every time another father thanked him for his help, he felt like he was doing something right. It was his redemption, his way of proving that even a broken world can be rebuilt. Spring came suddenly to Chicago, as if the city had decided to throw off the weight of winter. Robert and Bella moved into a new house, not as big as their old mansion, but cozy, with a spacious backyard where Bella could play and Mr. Whiskers could lazily bask in the sun. The house was a new beginning, a place where there was no place for the shadows of the past. Robert chose the furniture himself, painted the walls, hung shelves for Bella's books, and every nail driven into the house was a symbol of new life. On one of the first warm days of April, Robert and Bella went outside. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was filled with the scent of cherry blossoms. Bella, wearing a bright yellow t-shirt and with her pigtails bouncing with every step, held a plastic bubble gun. She ran through the grass, laughing as bubbles rose into the air, shimmering in the sun like little rainbows. "Daddy, catch!" she shouted, pointing the gun at him. A stream of bubbles enveloped Robert, and he laughed, trying to catch them in his palms. "You're too fast, detective," he cried, pretending he couldn't keep up with her. "I give up." Bella ran up to him, her eyes shining with joy. "You can't give up. We haven't found the treasure yet," she declared, pointing to the wooden chest Robert had hidden under the tree for her latest detective game. Robert smiled, feeling warmth spreading through his chest. He knelt down to be level with his daughter and adjusted her braid. "Then lead the way, Detective Bella," he said, his voice soft and full of love. "Show me where the treasure is." She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the tree, her laughter ringing like a bell. Robert followed, his heart light as a bubble floating in the air. He looked at her smile, at her energy, and knew that everything he had been through, the pain, the betrayal, the judgment, had been worth it. For this moment, for this new dawn. Mr. Whiskers, lounging lazily on the porch, watched them, squinting into the sun. The city hummed in the distance, but here, in the yard of their new home, it was their world alone, a world without betrayal, where there was only love and laughter and hope. Robert picked Bella up in his arms, spinning her around in the air, and her squeal of joy was the most beautiful sound he could imagine. "Daddy, higher!" she screamed, her hands reaching for the sky. And Robert laughed, twirling her, feeling the last shadows of the past dissolve in the bright light of this day. He had built a new life, brick by brick, and now, looking at his daughter, he knew that the foundation of this house was stronger than anything he had ever built before. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.